Cups this morning, and you can see some of the cups that I've made back here. It's an item that I made from the very beginning, and they have evolved over time. The longer we work, the more our work evolves, and often it goes in directions that we couldn't really predict. And sometimes it's not because of conscious decisions, it's just from consistent making. It seems like we all start out just trying to learn the process, and then that changes and it becomes more expressive. And as we become more on good terms with the clay, it stops telling us what to do, and we gain the upper hand, you might say, and then we can begin to figure out what kinds of cups we want to make. And because they're small, we make them in series, and that way we don't work the way I'm going to work today, which is to make cups, but each one is going to be a little bit different. So, and I'll talk about it, and I'll also I have to apologize in advance for telling stories about Westchester, because I went to school here and I graduated 60 years ago, and it just seems really remarkable to be back here. I had a life-changing experience here, maybe a couple of them, and I drove past this building. Yeah. Just one of these, maybe.
It's always good to have a selection.
Yeah, thanks. I like to be tipping toward the wheel, and this is going to help a little bit. Maybe this is a little much. Yeah, I like this. Do you have any foam, like to sit on?
We'll get you a cushion. Do you have some? Where would you like your wearables to?
Oh, that it could go right across one of the 5-gallon buckets. Yeah.
Are we starting?
Yeah, we can.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
You prefer these or those?
Yeah. How about just across the board here would be okay. Thanks. That's pretty good. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Can I say a couple words?
Sure.
Is it 10 o'clock?
Is it? I don't know.
It's 10:02. 10:02.
Yeah.
Well, you all know Jack's an alum of Westchester. If you don't know that, I'll inform you of that. But in tradition, we want to present Jack with a Westchester official hat.
Oh, wow.
And,
great.
And also Westchester Pride pin. Welcome back to your alum.
Thank you.
As an alum
Oh.
to your alma mater.
Fabulous. Clay-colored hat. Dynamite.
Is that
Far
good?
better.
Get the label and all.
Yeah.
Here's your pin for later. So.
Good. Okay.
So, and we're honored to have Jack here for the Visiting Artist Series for 2021. We tried to do this in 2020, but you know what the story is with that. So, Jack has quite a resume. He's a poet, an author, a teacher, and a potter. International potter as it is. He's been recognized, again, you guys know his background, by NCCA and Pennsylvania Council of the Arts, much more. But I don't want to belabor all of that. I want to welcome Jack. Thank you for being here, and we look forward to 2 great days. Thanks, Jack.
Thank you. And John was one of my very first students in 1970. I made a couple of career switches The first one was to go from being an English teacher to being a potter, and doing them both for 10 years, 5 years in high school teaching and 5 years in college. And then I think it was about 2 years after you took my class that I stopped teaching English. This was at Juniata College up in Huntington. And John has gone on to really have a big impact on the art scene in this area, as you know. And it's just such a pleasure to be back here. And yeah.
Thanks, Jack. Welcome back. Since we're recognizing folks, I want to recognize Andrew Snyder for all
of course. Oh, sorry.
Sophie and Maya, his two interns, for all their work.
Yep.
Behind the scenes, back behind the camera, making sure all this happens, and also Seth for, he's not here right now, but he had a lot to do with all this technology stuff that you guys know better what's going on.
Yeah. Fabulous.
Jack, all of you.
Okay, thanks so much. Oh, yeah, thanks. Seats get harder with the years. Thank you. Well, this is really a full circle adventure coming back here to work. I came to Westchester as a phys ed major in 1956. I was my high school class's sub-salutatorian. I graduated next to last in my class, and I could only get into college by being good in sports. And when I got here, sports were really serious, and I had a moment in this place called Erringer Gym. I noticed it's still there, really steep, angled roof. And I was in this class with about 60 other guys, and we were taking a tap dancing class. And there was a woman up in the front playing the Darktown Strutters Ball on an old piano. And we were all, you know, spaced alphabetically. And right in the middle of the Darktown Strutters Ball, I had this epiphany. It's like a little voice that said, "What are you doing with your life?" And I thought, yeah, what am I doing with my life? And I left. I just walked away. I took off my shoes with the clickers on the toes, got out of my stretchy blue pants, walked across the street, and I became an English major. And it just changed everything. I started hanging out with theater people, being in plays, and just going on to be an English teacher in high school. And I really like that. I like that whole aspect of listening to yourself and figuring out where you should be and where you don't have to be. And that was a big moment. It was dramatic, especially in retrospect. Looking back at it, it was a really important time. So here's a cup. There's a time when we get so we can center on the wheel, pull things up, and then as we go along, using a cup that is a mug or a handled cup seems to have some limitations. And it was important for me to make the transition from making mugs into making cups that you hold in both hands to drink from. And it came when I realized something about handled cups. This is not how I make handles, but I'm going to illustrate a point with it. Unfortunate that it's on camera, but what a ghastly cup. Okay, so when we use a cup that has a handle on it, if we're a right-handed person, we look at this all the time. That's the first side, person across the table from us or a left-handed person sees the second side, and there's a third side over here, and the fourth side where the handle is. So we're thinking about cups as three-dimensional objects, but we're really giving them four sides as soon as we put a handle on. And that's fine. And I've made thousands and thousands of cups. I brought a cup with a handle on to show you I know how to do it. But mostly the cups that I'm making now are cups to be drunk from as a kind of tea bowl. Now, I know that there's a scientific and artistic conjugation that comes together for making real tea bowls. So I haven't studied tea and I haven't studied tea bowls, but what I have done is just make a little stamp with a T on it in a circle, and I stamp my bowls with that, so they're tea bowls. They're not tea. Okay? So I'm halfway home. But until I study tea, I don't really want to call them official tea bowls. But to begin with, just getting the clay to stay on the wheel is an accomplishment, and centering. I taught at Juniata College for 39 years, and I never had a student who took as long to learn to center as I did. I have no native ability, whatever that is. I don't have it. I worked so hard with my first teacher, who was the art teacher at Nether Providence High School, where I learned to throw. He was so patient. He was the first Quaker I ever met. And we stayed after school, and I watched Jim throw for weeks and weeks until one day I thought, I wonder if I could do that. And I couldn't center. And I would get Jim to come back. He would be teaching a class when he had a free moment. I'd say, Jim, come back, see if this is centered. He'd say, oh, not quite, Jack, not quite. So one day, this is how a Quaker loses his patience. He said, Jack, if you have to ask, it isn't centered. I thought, yeah, okay. So it's a matter of feeling. He could have said, you'll feel when it's centered, and we do. And once we feel that way, once we gain that confidence, then we're off and away. But it takes people different times to learn it. And then I started making little bottles about so big, and they had really lovely shapes because I've been looking at pottery forms in magazines and books. And Jim passed away 6 months after teaching me. And so I went into what was then the Philadelphia College of Art, and I studied with a guy named Louis Mendez. And I was making these little bottles and feeling quite happy about them because they had good shapes. But one night Louis came past my wheel, and I could tell he had been thinking about something, and maybe he had been reluctant to bring it up. But he asked me the central question of my career, and that is, Jack, do you want to keep making what you're making, or do you want to learn to make really good pots? Well, when somebody asks you that question, what can you say? Yeah, quality matters, doesn't it? So I want to learn to make really good pots. So he said, I'd like you to take 6 balls of clay about the size of a tennis ball and just throw 6 cylinders. I couldn't do that. And when I did make a cylinder, when we cut it in half, it just tapered and it was really thick at the base. So Louis's way of making a cylinder was to center the clay flat and think about it as architecture. So you're making a floor, you're coming out and grabbing the clay, and so now it has a cross section like this, and then you make this radical pull in and up, and then each pull a little straighter. Now I know where all the clay is, so when I start pulling it up, I can feel that it's getting fairly even. And we were taught never to use ribs, so I always use ribs now. Throwing a cylinder is like writing a paragraph. It's the basic structure. You can stretch it out, you can make it into bottles, jars, pitchers, anything you like, as long as you have a cylinder. So forgive me if this is too elementary. It's something we all learn. It doesn't go away, and it's part of our growth record. And then you always cut them up. Getting rid of preciousness about what we make is really significant. So you want to have some kind of consistency to the cylinder, and once we get that, we're really on our way. And also, if you have any questions about anything, I'll be happy to answer that. So, after making thousands of mugs and making handles that I felt good about, I learned that at Alfred University. I went to Alfred for a couple of summer classes, and Val Cushing was my teacher, and I told him I admired the handles on his cups and that I would like to learn to make good handles. Mine were all like rat tails, I didn't have a clue about ergonomics, how the handle should feel in your fingers. So he said, well, why don't you make 100 cups, Jack? I thought, 100 of anything. Okay, you're the teacher. So I made 100 cups, and about the first dozen or 20 were pretty grim. And then I think it was when I stopped being so self-conscious about wanting to make good handles that the handles got bigger, because it was more intuitive. And whenever we're learning something and it becomes intuitive for us, then we have it forever, because what we've done is teach the body. Learning to use a wheel is almost exactly like learning to play a musical instrument. You teach the body where to chord, an E major chord, E flat chord, and pretty soon you're not even thinking about it. You're making music and not chords, and it's that way with the wheel. So supposedly, when we do something 10,000 times, it doesn't matter if it's making mugs or taking out an appendix. If we do it 10,000 times, we have a facility at it, and we're learning to use muscle memory and whatever kind of magic stays with us. I can't get over the magic that's involved in throwing. In the 1970s, I was reading a lot about how the brain works. And it occurred to me that in our part of the world, the wheel always goes counterclockwise. And that means that the right half of the brain is working with the inside of the pot, and vice versa. And that took me back to high school and learning about the Coriolis Effect in physics. One time I was riding with a coach on the way back from a track meet, and I like to take long showers, and I often had to sit with the coach in the bus. And we were riding along, and I said, "Mr. Wrights, are we ever going to go to a school where we run the other way on the track? Like, is that just because we're in Berks County or Pennsylvania? If we go to Australia, do we run the other way on the track?" Mr. Wrights had never thought about this before, I think. He looked out the window for a long time, and he said, "Oh, Christ, Jack, just run." I thought, okay. A good track coach answer. I just ran, but I continued to think about this thing, because in Japan, wheels go the other way around. And with wheels now, we can reverse them if we want to. But this was how we think about it. So when we make a straight form like this, it's really this rib, the controlling hand that's keeping that clay toward the center. And at some point, I think it was from using other people's cups, that I wanted to get some sense of movement in the cup, so that even when it was fired hard, it would say, I used to be plastic. I used to have movement. And not only that, when we pick up a cup that has some kind of variation in it, we handle it differently. There's going to be a place where our hands fit. And that comes from letting the right brain and the left hand have a little bit of a say in the kind of form that we make. So I have this stiff form, and I'm going to, this is so hard to explain. If we had a movie, you could slow it down. But it's a way of pushing out and varying it. And the first one's going to be horrible. So don't be embarrassed for me. I have to make a series of these to get one that's halfway decent. Andrew, can you reach my, don't I have a chamois over there, or didn't I bring it?
I brought one.
You got one?
Acceptable?
Oh, good. Yep, thanks. I like to pay quite a bit of attention to the rim. Don't like a rim that goes in. It's hard to drink from. And with these cups, I'm going to do most of the work when it's on the wheel. I'm going to trim them. But I want to have as little trimming as possible. Well, this is a start. You can see a couple things. Because I used a hard edge rib, there are little lines in here. And if you can imagine a glaze flowing over this, because it's vertical, the glaze is going to want to shift. And it's going to accentuate any little marks like that. And also, it's going to force the reader in a nice, the handler in a nice way to figure out where the hand fits. And it's going to shrink about 20% because it's porcelain. So it's going to be a little different for each person. But if you go back there and you just pick up those cups of mine, you don't know if it has a front or not. You have to figure that out visually and in a tactile way. So I like setting up that variation. And also, it looks as if this cup might have gone to ballet school instead of a military academy. The straight lined cup is a militant form. I think of it as that. And departing from the straight line form involves risk and a willingness to say it's not going to be right away. And boy, for me, working with clay is definitely involved in risk taking, being willing to say that out of this dozen cups, 2 of them look pretty good, and the others I'll wedge up and use again for something else. So it's good to have a rhythm. It's a discipline. I think of throwing as harmless power, maybe even beneficial power. Don't know when the 10,000th pot was, but it was quite a while ago. I like to compact the bottom of the cup. Sometimes you get S cracks in the bottom if it's not compressed, and nice to have a sense of rightness about what we're doing. Hard to put it in words, but you come into the studio the next day and you look at maybe 50 cups you've made the day before, and they're just certain ones that you weren't even thinking about. And you're working subconsciously and intuitively, and inevitably those are some of the best pieces we make. We're surprised. They look like they might have been made by somebody better. Okay, I'll make a couple more of these, and I'll show you about the stamps that I use sometimes. Okay, there's just one move. So I'm going to alter that. I'm going to make it go in another direction. Ooh. Clay's a little soft for me, but don't ever blame the clay, please. It's a mindless material, and we should know better. Okay, this has a serious hip displacement. So I can do better. I'll do one more and then I'll make some stamps. And of course, all the time you're thinking about what kind of surface you want to have on the pot, what kind of glaze you want to put on it. And so little variations in the texture and the form are going to influence how the glaze behaves. The glaze is so active during the firing that it's trying to slide down a little bit on the vertical surface, and it's creating little nuances that we don't actually put there, but we set the stage for things to happen. Yeah. Let's let some of this clay stiffen up some, Andrew. After it's wedged, I'm having to baby it. See, because I know the kind of cup I make, I don't know what it's going to look like, but I know the type, and so I'm pushing underneath here. Don't know if you can see it with the pan here, but I know I'm going to have a trimmed foot, which gives the cup some lift, and so I'm pushing under as soon as I open the ball of clay.
Blocks to stick that board on. I feel like it falls off.
Oh, okay.
Did you say you wanted
I'll have to put some on both ends.
a little bit?
Yeah, the rib is pulling up, and the hand inside is it's either under or over the rib. Yeah, I think it's above the rib. I did this in New Zealand, and a little voice in the back said, "Can you sell cups like that?" I don't know. I probably said, "Well, I can try," and I was making salt glaze pieces then. So, yeah, I like that variation. I like those little lines with a really sensitive glaze, like a Chino glaze. It'll find out where it belongs on the cup. And there will be little subtle differences from one side to the other. And maybe that'll coordinate with the way you pick it up. See, the hand accommodates itself to a curved form and an irregular form. And there are lots of people who will never get used to using a cup like that, and that's fine. That's why there's Walmart. They make 100,000 cups, and they all look exactly alike from Indiana to Southern California, and that's fine. If your favorite cup is a Walmart cup, more power to you. But you know, when you make something, you make one thing. It's really a gift from one person to somebody else. And when you have a favorite cup that somebody made, you don't have to have a reason for it. It just feels like the cup you should be drinking from at the time. Maybe it's a cup that you go to time and again. And a lot of the wood-fired cups especially don't give themselves up easily. Walmart cup is the same Walmart cup that you saw and were attracted to years later. And there's nothing mysterious in it. There's nothing that varies. And here you may notice something, kind of like looking at a painting. I'm not equating a cup with a painting, but in the sense that you notice something in it. You notice something in a piece of music that you didn't notice before. And it's like that with handmade pots. They don't tell you everything about them as soon as you see them. It's a process of learning. And we're all under the illusion that the world does not have enough cups. And we could all stop making cups today and there would still be plenty of cups. But the reason we're doing this is that it is an illusion, and it's okay to have productive, harmless illusions, and we make them, and we'll make them for our whole lives, and we're also making an audience for them. So when I teach workshops, I usually ask people 3 questions. How many of you grew up in using handmade pots in your homes? I'll ask you. Any hands go up? 1. Pathetic. Yeah, we want to change the world, you know. And so second is, how many of you know a poem by heart?
Does the song count?
Hmm?
Does the song count?
No, a poem. Okay, good. And then we go from the physical to the metaphysical. What was your first aesthetic experience? Everybody has a first aesthetic experience, and it always happens before we ever hear the word aesthetic. So it's an experience that moves you so deeply that you never forget it. And it's a beautiful experience, or an experience that makes you realize that you're in the world and the world is leaving an impact on you, not like being hit by a truck, but by being hit by a beautiful tree or a sunset, something conventional, or something that somebody says to you that stays with you. And everybody has that. And then just this week, I figured there should be a 4th question. The 4th question is, describe a day in your life that changed you irrevocably. You could never go back to being the person you were after that day, like walking out of the tap dancing class. It just, you know, seems so peculiar, but it doesn't matter if it's peculiar or not. If it shapes you, if it sends you in some direction in your life, it's important. So those kinds of things, I think, our awareness of those things develops as we're working. This is a meditative process after a while. At first, it's not meditative because it takes our powers of concentration and consciousness to do what we're doing. But after that, I find it a remarkably meditative process. And I'm awfully glad I learned it. There was no rational reason to learn this. Nobody said, you're going to win a prize with one of your pots someday. I thought, is that a good reason to keep doing this? No, it's not. Somebody's going to invite you to come to New Zealand and fire a kill if you can send her this clay? No. Surprises happen. Okay, I'm going to use a stamp on this one, a little bigger piece. It may be a little bit wet, but we'll see how it works. Me and my boards. These are a couple stamps just made out of clay. Pressed a texture into them and then bisque fired them. I bisque fire to cone 012. It's a very low bisque. And the pots that have the orange flashing on them come from having been bisqued, thanks, to a low temperature. And when you glaze them, if the glaze has a soda ash in it, the soda ash kind of wicks into the clay, and it helps to leave that bright orange flashing. And it saves electricity and doesn't take us long to fire the kiln. And when I taught, I always fired to cone 012, and it didn't have any problems. Okay, this is a little thing I made on a wheel, and bisque fired it, and it gives a really nice tactile quality to it. Good. I turn it a quarter turn each time, so each side is a little bit different. We're so conditioned by smoothness and symmetry, especially in the vessels we use. We grow up using pots that don't have a tactile presence. I like to think that some of the pieces I make would be appealing to blind people. One time I taught at Kent State University, and I had two blind people in my class, Paul and Paula. And they met in that class, and they got married at the end of the semester. And watching them work and talking to them while they were working, the only people I'd ever met who couldn't see what they were doing, but they were making pieces. And I since met a blind potter in West Virginia who made really good pots. Her husband helped her with things like weighing out glaze materials, but she worked on the wheel and did really well. And one time, this was in the early 60s, the great folk musician Doc Watson played at Swarthmore College, and I went to hear him. And then I went to hear him at a little coffee house outside Philadelphia, and he was very approachable. We went back and talked with him during the set, between the sets, and he said the most extraordinary thing, that he never regretted being blind and not being able to see his wife or his children. He felt that the most human part of who we are comes across in the way we relate to each other in speaking and touch, and that he never regretted being blind and not seeing them. He said he knew all of these cautionary things, like all that glitters is not gold, and you can't tell a book by its cover, And so he felt that the essential aspect of humanity came across independent of vision. And he came to our college once and gave a concert, and it was before cell phones. When I went up to speak with him, he asked if he could use a telephone because he wanted to call his wife. She was ill. And so we went over to the studio, and he made his call, and he said, "What kind of work do you do? What do you do here?" And I told him I made pots, and I had just unloaded a kill of little porcelain bowls, really elegant little porcelain bowls. And I handed them to him, and he felt each one. And he came to the one that was my favorite, and he said, "Now this one's really beautiful." Oh, I was just so smitten. I thought, wrap it up, take it home. You know, it just seems so remarkable that somebody who couldn't see it could sense something in that bowl, the specialness of it. What an honor. I mean, when somebody says that to you, it hits you in a very different place than if somebody says, "We want to put this pot of yours in our collection, in our museum." That's a very nice thing too, but it's not emotionally gratifying. It might be for some people. You'll have to speak up for me.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Do you make your metal ribs yourself, or they seem thicker?
No, this is a tool from, come on, help me out.
ZMXIEN, is it one of those?
No,
A tool company?
nope. The guy's a really good artist.
Cheryl. It's a Cheryl tool.
Maybe, yeah. North Carolina. I know that's where they're from. Okay, well, here's something you could use for a long time. You could just study it. You can feel it. Whatever glaze it's going to go on here is going to find out where it belongs. It's going to settle into all these textural marks. Andrew has a nice one of these over in his office that has an impressed texture. And here's how the texture is made. You can do variations on this. I'll use the whole thing. I'm just going to flatten this out. Yeah, you can do better than that. I use the stick. Okay, can make variations on these and bisque fire them, use them as stamps. I pretty well worked through this series of making them. This might be a good time to talk to you about history, especially the history right around here. When I would teach a workshop for several days, and we're going to be working together as a class, I would ask people how many of them were aware of potters who used to work in their area, in the area where they grew up. Do any of you have any awareness of the potters that worked in Chester County, for example? No, no, no. 100%? No. No, don't ask me. Ask somebody else. Well, at one time there were around 100 potters working in the Chester County area. I'm talking about the 19th century. Many of them were Quakers, and many of them were instrumental in the abolitionist movement. And because the Mason-Dixon line is the Maryland border, slaves were escaping this time of year, especially when the weather got warmer, and the slaves were coming into Pennsylvania, and they were the potters were part of the Underground Railroad system. They would hide sometimes whole families of slaves in their kilns. They would hire them to work cutting wood for their kilns, processing clay, and then they would move them on often to another potter in a wagon load of straw. They carried their pottery in wagons and covered it in straw. And then sometimes they would have a slave or more than one slave in a big wagon with pottery and straw. And they would often take them at night. And the slaves were headed mostly to Canada. And I wrote a poem about that. There were a lot of potters over around Kennett Square and Avondale. This poem's called The Wind in a Jug. To the abolitionist potters of Chester County, Pennsylvania. Bluebird potters, they called you. Your kill smoke grafting winter onto spring. You had the power to call birds north with a gallon crock wrung by your knuckle, toning the fire-burst heat to the breeze, that clear note drifting south below the Mason-Dixon line. Your county's hills enclose me here the way that sleepers' knees push up green quilts in this fieldstone cellar hole open to March's sky. I find your stoneware jug tamped in a niche 150 years ago. Blue-gray clay hide restrains the bulbous dark inside. I sniff the vinegared past, tip to my ear this conch, this echo holder, stamped with a whorl by the handle's base. I read you by your thumbprint, Potter. Malin Brocious, John Vickers, I hear you in there. My breath across the jug mouth rumbles. Sound spills from this clay chrysalis like that of distant tumbrils, or your wagons mounded high with straw-packed mugs and porringers. Slaves, runaways, were the heart of your cargo. Scheming their freedom, you trundled them north, Quaker to Quaker, binding the law's weak wrists with your compassion. Within these cellar walls, I'm centered, like a man who wakes up in a bowl. This stony jug's the gift of time and flesh and fire. This hand-fixed form now shapes the wind these bluebirds ride and liven with their song. Hold back here, Jug, the earth from closing down. So it matters when people have a history to know that this is not an isolated thing that we're doing. It's isolated in the context of where we live because we're actually making things instead of just buying things that other people have made. We're part of an ongoing making process. What always bugs me is that when all these potters died, they were being replaced by the glassware industry and by industrial ceramics. They all went to the graves feeling that their skills were no longer needed. Nobody coming up wanted to learn to become potters. And the last potter around here died up around Honeybrook in the 1930s. And then in about 2 generations, the next generation, really, after World War II, people began making pots. But there were no old potters left for new potters to go and talk to. And there was no continuity. There was no tradition, except in the South and in the Southwest, where the Native American pottery tradition was going strong. So in those 2 places, pottery continued in an unbroken line of succession. But here it was really a lost cause. I think there's an unwritten novel about that time when they were modernizing pottery. They were hooking the wheels to steam engines, and they could run 5 wheels at a time. And the shapes of the pottery changed too, became a lot more straight-sided. There was less of a bulbousness to the early pieces. They lost that. So yeah, somebody should write that novel. I can give them a lot of information about it. But anyway, let's see. Maybe enough about cups. How about putting pieces together to make them larger? If you can throw a good cylinder, you can throw a cylinder twice that size without grunting and groaning and hurting your body. So I'll just put 2 little cylinders together here and show you about that. So we make a little cylinder, not real thin. You might think to make a pot twice as big, you need twice as much clay. And there are some people who do that. That's fine. I'm aiming this at people who are beginning to intermediate people. And you'll find that the technique works really well for anybody. It's how I make almost everything over, I don't know, about the size of all those things back there. They're 2 pieces, like a pitcher. Everything but the cups, everything but the small things. They're all made like this. So this is going to be the top. And I'm going to open it right down to the wheel head. Always a nice thing. You don't have to worry about how thick the floor is. There's no floor. I'm going to squeeze it, bring it in. Compress it, dry it up a little bit. It's going to taper in, and I'm going to enhance the taper a little bit. Put this over here in a wet place. Yep, we will need some stiffer clay. But yeah, if you could wedge it and then stand it up in those inverted coils, that would be nice. Thank you. Anything that's there. Yeah, this is all new clay to me, so I'm learning about it. Okay, this is going to be the bottom of the larger piece. I can make something bigger eventually. I'm going to be here for 2 days. I had the most uncanny feeling this morning. I woke up in the Warner Hotel, and that used to be a theater when I was a student. And one Sunday evening, a black girl and I went to a movie in the Warner Theater. And I woke up thinking, wonder what part of the theater we were sitting in. Because I parked my car in the parking garage. You know, it's something that only a geriatric archaeologist can think of. You go back and you reconstruct your life. And the next day, the Dean of Men came to the classroom where I was. And did he slide a note under the door saying, "Jack Troy, please come to my office"? No, he opened the door and he said, "Troy, my office!" "Yes, sir." I went down there. He gave me a lecture. He asked me if I was going to be a teacher. I said yes. He said, did I know that the company I kept as a teacher was going to be important to my social standing? Yes, I said. He said, did he know that the people I socialized with might have an impact on my salary? Yes. And then he said, do you know what I'm talking about? I didn't say anything. He said, get out of here. That's how you learned about race in the 1950s. Really scary. I mean, we went to a movie. We weren't engaged. You know, we're just going to a movie. I'm so grateful people don't have to worry about that. That kind of power, I think, came from being in the military, and that was how it was. A lot of military officers after World War II went into education and had that kind of attitude towards people. Okay, now, if I were you, I would have measured this with a calipers. The top of this one is widening out a little bit. The top of this one is narrowing. It's really pretty juicy. Okay, so I'm just going to set it there. And there's going to be an overlap of about 1 inch in here. You ought to try this sometime. It doesn't mean that big pots are better. It just means that you have an option that you might not have had. If you weren't here today. So I'm working the clay back and forth with the rib and with my fingers and the sponge. You notice I throw with a sponge quite a bit. That way I don't have to keep adding water to the clay because that weakens it. So now I want to coax this so that I have an unbroken seam down here. And I also have some clay in the middle that should let me stretch it out into a spherical form. Spherical forms are really quite challenging, and I love them. I love making bottles. I love classical pottery. Okay, so this was the bottom of my piece. Now it's the top of this one. And I want to take off flabby clay from the outside. I want to try to compress this cylinder. Okay, so I make some kind of spherical form. If you keep the top small, you can always make it bigger. But once it gets bigger, it almost wants to turn into a bowl. Okay, so I have a little tool here. And this tool should have, isn't there a small one of these in there someplace? Or
There's a
not?
whole bunch of them over there. You can grab one.
Yeah, okay. These back scratchers double as a pottery tool. Yeah, thank you. And flexible metal rib. Sorry to. Kidney shaped one. Yeah, thanks. Okay, choke this in, level it out. If you keep the top small, you can go down in with a tool. There are a lot of different tools. Japanese name is igote, E-G-O-T-E. And that goes down inside. And see, it scrapes some clay off in there. I'm looking forward to get some stiffer clay. I'm not blaming the clay, I'm blaming the stiffness of it. But see, I'm trimming the inside a little bit. See, I can't use my finger inside to do this, so the tool does the work. And you can pull up a high shoulder. And all the time the clay is getting thinner. Thinner is stronger. Excuse me? It's
did you say thinner is stronger?
yes, thinner is stronger. Mm-hmm. If it's drier also, thinner and drier is stronger. The wall of the piece is getting thinner because this sharp edge, which is really a rib, it's taking away the moisture from the clay. So it helps me to define the form. And when I get clay that's a little stiffer, I feel as though I'll have a little more control.
Is it also due to the compression, that more you're throwing and pulling up, you're compressing it more as well?
Yes, yep, it's really about compression. And also, the piece is stronger now, so I can just exercise some of my options up here with the neck. So maybe I'll try closing it in. I also use a little hand torch on these things because they stiffen up the wall of the piece and let you work on more extreme necks.
We brought it in here if you wanted, Jack.
Yeah?
Yeah, do you want?
Not right now. I want to make some larger pieces eventually. I just have to get over being nervous. That'll take most of the day. No, it just feels so nice to work and be able to tell stories. And I had to apologize for not having you introduce yourselves. I always make a point of asking who people are and where they're from and what their background is. And we will get to that. Okay, so a little bottle. I've never gotten tired of making these little forms. Okay, now I'm going to use a stick. This is a wonderful tool, too. I think Cindy Bringle might have invented these in wood, and my friend John Troop apparently made this one. Okay, now here's what happens. You know, to me, it just looks dumpy. It needs a smaller foot, but I don't turn these over and trim them. I try to trim them while they're still on the wheel, because with a smaller foot, the smaller the foot gets, the more the pot is going to look like it's holding its breath. It's going to rise off the foot. So the smaller the foot, the more visually it looks like it's holding its breath, like it's inhaling. So I'm holding it with my left hand. Just a little wet.
I noticed that on most of your larger pieces in the bottles, you don't have much texture on that. Is that a deliberate choice for your firing?
Not much texture.
No, I mean like, not in the same way that you were working on for your
Cups.
bowls,
Yeah.
your cups, yeah.
Uh-huh. Right. And that's because I like to have the fire. I think of them as globes. I think of them as a canvas for the fire. And I haven't textured them for that reason. So I try to use clays that are quite sensitive to the fire, and I'm happy to see the patterns that the fire makes on them. Yeah, that's a very good question, a very good point. So I know that there are people who are really great at drawing on them. There's a guy that fires with us who's fantastic, and he just sprays a little Temako glaze on it, and they're great. I don't draw, and so I try to go for clays that are extremely sensitive to the fire. Okay, so the seam is gone, right? It's just not there anymore. I made it into a one-piece structure. I had that clay where they overlapped. That let me stretch it out into the body of the piece. So the same thing happens on a bigger scale with some of the other pieces in the show. Maybe we could take a little break and walk around. If there's any pots you'd like me to talk about or explain why they look the way they do, I'm happy to do that.
Jack, can you talk about your rattle? There's a whole table of rattles here. Will you?
Yes. Yep. Yeah. Yeah, let's take a little break and I'll come back. What time is it?
11:18.
11:02. Okay, good. Yeah, I'll do that. Thanks, Andrew. Little rattles themselves are made out of these things. These are porcelain pieces that go inside of ball mills for grinding glaze ingredients. I have a refractories recycler outside of my town, and he's been immensely helpful over the years. And so he has 55-gallon drums full of these things.
Are they already fired or are they just green? The little balls, are they already fired, did you say, or they're just green?
Some of them are cylindrical, but they're all fired to an extremely high temperature. And so I just take some tape and put them together. And pop them in a piece, and the tape burns away. because otherwise they might stick to the wet clay and stay there forever. Well, maybe I'll make a little bit bigger one. This is the B-mix clay. Well, it's going to make a big horn too. I think that's where these things might have started. This clay is more to my liking, a little stiffer. Well, Maggie, do you know about Jordan clay? Yeah?
This is pretty much what Stanton seems to be. The Jordan clay that was mined down near Baltimore in a town, I think it's called Pop. It's become a housing development.
I'd like to talk with you about that. That's my favorite clay. There are 2 pots here made out of Jordan. And when my friend passed away 8 years ago, he left about 2 tons of Jordan and Calvert. And I've been buying it from his partner, and then she passed away recently. So I've been working with their relatives to help settle the estate. John Troop is the potter, and he lived up in Burnville. And he never bought a bag of this or a bag of that. He left, imagine, a ton of Gersley borate. I mean, why would anybody buy that much Gersley borate? It's just one glaze ingredient. Okay, so this starts out I'm leaving a floor in here. I'm going to compress it. Sometimes I wonder if I'd ever make a pot and know that it was the best one I could ever make, and that's why I made all the other ones, and then I would quit. I mean, you're free to explore all kinds of ridiculous ideas while you're working, but could it happen? I think I would know if I saw it.
Are all those throwing sticks from someplace else too, or is it
Yeah, I have them made. I designed them, and I have them made by an Amish furniture maker friend. They're made out of cherry. The one thing I learned from blowing glass when I was in grad school is that you always use fruit wood for wood that's going to be in water. You know, glass blowers have these blocks that are scooped and they blow the glass into them, and they don't check and crack apart. So these are cherry. Apple would work. Name your fruit.
Are you making one of those rattles, Jack?
Hmm?
Making a rattle?
Mm-hmm.
When you're starting to, do you have a general plan of the shape if it's going to be on its side or upright?
No, I do that afterward when I'm fooling around with it when it's leather hard. When the clay is about soft leather hard, it's just one of my favorite stages. I love to modify things by paddling them. Those longer rattles over there, I'll make some of those things tomorrow. This afternoon, I'll throw some pieces to play with tomorrow with paddles. There's some bee mix that has sand in it, but this one is really smooth. It's more like porcelain. So I want to elongate this, kind of like making a great big teapot spout. Now, if I had a dowel, I'd go down in here. Whenever you choke it and put torque into it, then try to go down in it and counteract that by pulling up against something. You don't have any dowels, do you?
I have the end of a needle tool, but it's probably not long enough, though.
No, it would be nice to have a foot-long dowel.
Put one down, I got that.
if you have a whole lot of torque in there, chances are it might crack when it fires. I think there's nothing wrong with making some things that are just fun. So little of what we make has any appeal to children, and I like to think that children would like to pick something up and hear it say something that only they could understand. Okay, here he comes. Terrific, thank you. That helps compress everything. Okay, that should work. I'm going to be making a lot of these until I figure out the right proportions and all of that. But by that time, I'll have lost interest in. As one of the crew said last time, what's it with these, Jack?
Did you slip some of the pebbles in when I was out of the room?
Yeah.
Okay.
I went in very fast.
Yeah. Well, okay, maybe that's a good time to take a break. Thank you. Thanks. You guys are really quiet. Do you have any questions? What are you going to think about on your way home that wish you had asked?
Okay, are you gonna put a hole in that somewhere?
Yeah, I'll put a hole in it when it's leather hard, and that usually pushes the inside pieces away from the clay. Not that I have to worry about it, but yeah, sometimes I'll just slide a needle down in here. I have a very long-winded story that I'll spare you about making things that don't have holes in them, and they don't blow up. You can make them blow up if you fire them too quickly, but everything your mother told you about not firing things with holes without holes in them is negotiable. Okay, what other questions have you got? I love questions.
Jack, can you tell us about a day in your life in the studio? Do you go to the studio almost every day?
Yes, my partner and I share a studio, but never together. And that's my decision. Carol Ann could work with people around chatting and talking. She grew up working in a studio that way. I mean, not grew up, but she learned that way. And I have to be by myself and quiet, and or listening to the radio or something like that. I just really am easily distracted when I'm working. So I tend to work morning and afternoon sometimes. I gotta tell you, Carol Ann makes really terrific pots, soda glazed pots. But ever since she taught a workshop in Bali, she just is kind of thinking about what she's doing and not making so many pieces. And I think that will change, but she needs to get over something. And so I'm generally there working day and night sometimes. I try to not work quite so hard and with so many long hours anymore. When I was building a house and studio and paying for it as I went along, I was working probably too much, but I really enjoy working, And there were so many years growing up when I wondered about what I was going to do that I think I'm still compensating for those years. But it's really enjoyable. I mean, I really do feel as though this is something I was meant to do. And it continues to be a really good balance between challenge and reward. I like working with the group that comes to fire with me. That kind of brings me out of my making hole in the studio. And we have a crew of about a dozen people that come to fire the small kill. I have 2 Onagama kills. About a dozen people fire it, usually for 4 days. And then the big kill in the woods, we fire that once a year in June. And that takes about 18 to 20 people to fire that one. And the smaller kill we fire twice, in November and in March. And in terms of making, I know what I'm going to make when I go out there. I know what clay I'm going to use, and I know what part of the kill that clay is going to do well in. In the big kill, I use 6 different kinds of clay, and they all go in different parts of the kill, and the scale of that work depends on where they're going to be located in the kill, because the kill has different zones in it. And I have one clay that only a fanatic would use. It has an 18-inch square window of opportunity, and too far to the fire, it cracks and comes apart. And beyond that, it looks like it's made out of chalk. And so it's really sweet. I don't have any of those pieces here, but to be able to know the materials that intimately and to be guided by your experience, it's pretty much what wood firing is all about. It's so, gets to be intuitive, and yet you never have it nailed down. Ken Matsuzaki is a terrific Japanese potter. He said he's been at it for 40-some years, and he says a typical firing is 1/3 of the pieces get thrown away, 1/3 get refired, and 1/3 are good enough to show. And I think that's a pretty good percentage. I took a picture of my shard pile from the last firing. Oh, geez. Almost all of my tea bowls just went in the garbage. I had 2 5-gallon buckets of tea bowls. That's a lot. And they weren't working. I think that one big one back there with the dark clay, that was probably the only one from the last firing. I mean, why would you do that? On the other hand, John, I know how to make 2 things that make people reach for their wallets automatically. And if I was doing this for money, as my friend says, why would you make anything else? Well, because of what it would turn me into, basically. And I don't want to be that, even if it means getting rich. So I'd really like what I'm doing. I'm glad my house is paid for. You know, I can pretty much make what I want, and people buy what I make. And so I think that's, if I have a master plan, that's it. And I like to talk about it. I like to share information. I think we're all incredibly privileged people, be able to do what we love to do. Very few people in the world can say that. I had a good friend, still a good friend, whose father could not understand why she wanted to become a potter after having a dual major in physics and English. He was quite sure that she had chosen two fields where she could make a good living, and when she got involved with clay, he thought, have it as a hobby, you know, have fun, make stuff for fun. But she was driven. She wanted to do it. And she did. And she became really good at it. She married a potter. They're both teaching up in Maine at the Maine College of Art. They have for probably 40 years. So I think anybody who loves what they do and can earn a living at it is privileged. One of my favorite unanswerable questions is whether in any given generation there's the same percentage of people who love what they do, or if it's getting better or getting worse. And we can't ever tell because we're right in the middle of the stream. But you know, it's pretty rare in history, I think, that people had much of a choice about what they wanted to do with their lives. And when I began meeting artists, I began meeting people whose entire life was about making art. And it just seemed like they were special people. And they are, or we are, or something, without bragging about it. It's just a terrific feeling to know that you're not waiting to find out what you really want to do. And I was in that boat for a while. Teaching English was really great. It taught me how to be a decent writer, reading thousands of compositions and learning the difference between continuous and continual. Stupid little rules like that you don't screw up when you're writing. It's just good to be able to write it, to step back from it. I really can't write and make pots at the same time. It's just two different things. And if I'm working on a group of new poems, and they should be out in a book in the fall. My only other book of poems is from 2003, and I love writing. As somebody said, I hate to write, but I love to have written. And that's how I feel. Sometimes what I write is about what I make. This winter, the birds ate nearly 40 pounds of suet. I often watch them peck and then convert a phantom steer's insides to flight, to feathered warmth a winter's night could not snuff out. Then I drove to class and showed you how to give energy to Earth's flesh, torquing our planet's flesh lump after lump into cups and bowls by the dozens. We gave them form, color, fire, energy. Can you feel in a teacup's heat that friction of change, the combustion of one thing becoming another? So when you have a little insight like that, you try to write it down. I mean, when my parents died, they were both cremated. And making the urns for my parents' ashes was such an honor, such an honor. And I weighed 8 pounds when I was born, and my mother's urn was made from 8 pounds of clay. And when you're there doing that, making that commitment, it's just a powerful event in your life. That all of the pots that you've made are always informing every other pot that you make. And so when you have that realization, then you write it down. You try to give it permanence. You try to keep it from being a fleeting thought. You try to give it existence. So that's what a poetic impulse is from. I'll finish up by reading another poem. This one is a new one. And be in my little bag. Anybody ever see the Writer's Almanac on? Yeah, I subscribe to that. It's free, and you get a poem every day in your email. This is called Once in Syracuse. And it starts with a quote from a poet, Mark Doty. What can words do but link what we know to what we don't, and so form a shape? Why don't you make a pot and then write a poem about it, she asked. As if the clay centered and opened its walls, spinning round the still cavity, might be a kind of mouth, and I, listening, could capture something rising from within. Meanwhile, the making continued, the hands detouring past the analytics of process, as if another self inside this one owned all the knowing. There, another cup done and set aside, another relative to the ones gone before, something the first bequeathed the most recent, and a silent chorus rising from them all. Everything, they remind us, used to be something else. I might use that last line as the title for the book. Everything used to be something else.
That's a great line.
I mean, think of anything that didn't used to be something else. So, good. Well, again, thank you for coming.